Frank Mitchell established the first Matador Range headquarters. He leased an abandoned Indian site where the buildings were weather-beaten and they were in total disrepair, falling down. The cowboys worked daily in roundups and cattle drives, and the old Indian settlements were close to where they worked, so they made do with those. It is in just such a location that my story takes place. Ike Blasingame and Ott Cassidy were to share their first winter in just such a camp. Now, the Indians themselves avoided the old buildings as some of their people had died in them. But what was it that they feared? The Native Americans were in fear because of some strange, unexplainable events that took place in those old buildings where their people had died. Even though they would not divulge what had taken place, it was enough to keep them at bay. They wanted no part of it. But there was one that it wouldn't bother to go in there again. I'll tell you about that in just a minute. It was just such a place that Ike and I stayed. An alleged haunted structure that was abandoned and in the process of completely falling down. In fact, as the two men were moving in, a Native American watched them and he warned them. Unhappy spirit live here, not want you here. He live here. While not really bothered by it right then, Ike and I likely had it in the back of their minds as they lived there. I know I certainly would. I'd still live there, but it would come to mind sometimes. Now, I would like to quote from the book Dakota Cowboy, written by Ike Blasingame. And he wrote, "As the weeks passed, the weather got colder. Snow fell regularly, but the cattle foraged the windswept hills, creeks and river bottoms, and wintered well enough. When we would get in from our work in the late afternoon, hungry as young wolves, whoever got to the camp first cooked enough food for the two. If I was alone, I'd fill up really good and then flop on my bunk for a short nap. And that is just what I was doing on the chilly winter day when old Crow Eagle slipped into our camp. When I awoke, startled, I had already had one foot on the warpath, and I dug up the hatchet then and there, figuratively speaking. The real cause, I continues, of the disturbance was something that couldn't happen often in a lifetime, if at all. When we find ourselves sunk in a strange world, halfway between awakeness and deep sleep, the mind, conscious of all that is happening, is yet unable to break away from sleep and pull itself to complete alertness. And that is how it was with me that day when old Crow Eagle slipped into our home and nearly scared me to death." So Crow Eagle wasn't afraid to go in there, evidently. Now, I pointed out that up and down the streams were camps where Indians still lived. And he was very aware that they watched him with curiosity whenever he and Ike would ride by, and Ike and Ott kept on an eye on them also. In fact, Ike realized that though the natives were peaceful at that point, his mind retained a time when they were not. In 1904 and 1905, there were still some significant conflicts going on at that time. So let's return to Ike's narrative. Now, I had made a long ride out over the river breaks, and since the day was almost done, when I cleared away the dishes, after eating, I laid down. Now, Ott and I had given the lower end of the beef shanks, as we used them, to Crow Eagle, one of their Indian neighbors, and he always seemed happy to get them, he said, because they always had a lot of meat left on them. Now, this particular day, the old fellow saw me ride in. He waited a while, then ambled over to get his hand out. By then, I was in that half-awake stage when I heard him come into the kitchen. Ike then recalled that he heard him ambling around in the kitchen and that he was gathering things up. And so Crow Eagle then entered the room where he was sleeping, and he picked up Ike's six-shooter. Probably not the brightest thing to do. But however, and saying something about his character, Crow Eagle set it back down. Ike continues, "The whole experience was as spooky as a wild nightmare from which I could not awaken, try as I might. When Crow Eagle went out the kitchen door, my whole body being made then made a fierce effort to arise, and I woke suddenly and in time to see the old Indian going along the trail in the timber, homeward bound, his sack of plunder over his shoulder. Now I was excited and annoyed by the half-dream. I jumped out the door and yelled for Crow Eagle to come back and dump out his cargo. And Ike saw that all he had taken were the beef bones, and feeling some relief told Crow Eagle to take them, but the old Indian was hurt, and he refused them. And of course it hurt him, because they are a proud people. Of course it was not Ike's intent to offend Crow Eagle, but he did want to impress on him not enter the cabin when he and Ott were out or were sleeping. Just don't come in. Still, Ike was bothered by Crow Eagle, the look Crow Eagle had on his face, so hurt and so offended. Ike was friends with the old Indian's son Joe, and so left to go talk to him. And with the sack of beef bones, Ike mounted his horse and headed to the Indian camp. Things got quickly straightened out. Ike had this to say about the old Indian's reaction. He grinned like a kid when he learned how he had scared me, and that I knew and could tell him everything that he did while he was in there, but couldn't wake up, and that I more than tried to arouse myself, but the more scared I got, like I was in a very bad dream. And when I finally broke out of that sleep, I was fighting mad and spoke meaner than I meant to speak to him. He was really a good old Indian, and after our powwow, we shook hands and buried the hatchet, again figuratively. Then we smoked a cigarette, which served as a peace pipe, and forever after we were friends. End quote. So Ike's lodging was probably not haunted. It could have been, but his dreamlike state reminds me of the sleep paralysis phenomenon. If you've ever experienced it or not experienced it, count yourself lucky, for I have, and it is indeed, it can be a horrifying experience. And so I can see where in Ike's position that it might have been connected to the legend of the cabin being haunted. Sleep paralysis, if you haven't experienced it, is where you're sleeping and then all of a sudden you feel like you're awake, but you cannot move you cannot move. You cannot move your mouth. You can't move anything. It's like being just frozen. And it doesn't last long, but it seems like it lasts an eternity when it's going on. And so, I can understand how he could relate that back to perhaps the cabin he lived in with Ott. Might have been haunted. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this little story, and thanks for stopping by. Thanks for listening, and I love you all very much. God bless you, and God willing, I'll be back with you real soon.